Hi, Roger Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. I'm joined by Sean Speer, my co-founder and editor at large. Sean, we're going to have a little bit of a conversation today with our audience about an editorial that you and I wrote this morning, April 1st. The reason that we're doing this is that we feel that this is a message we want to convey to our broader audience about a position that the Hub has taken on subsidies and the lack of response that the rest of the media seems to have assumed is their right in the face of receiving funding from the incumbent government, at least its legislation, during the election. Why don't you explain to our audience what we feel is the key issue here that Canadians need to focus on, because this is not an unserious concern.
Yeah, by way of background, listeners and viewers are probably familiar with the Online News Act, C-18, which mandated that American-based online platforms had to enter into some type of financial arrangement with news publishers. The legislation ultimately led to Meta, Facebook exiting news, but Google committing to $100 million annual payment to Canada's news industry to be delivered through a nonprofit third party. In the past several weeks, that legislation's implementation has taken shape. We have something called the Canadian Journalism Collective, which is responsible for dispersing funds to eligible news outlets. That work started in earnest, Rudyard, on March 11th, about 10 days or 2 weeks before this election kicked off. And those initial payments will continue through until the end of April, of course, all the way during an election campaign. The Journalism Collective has committed to releasing the full list of recipient organizations and their funding amounts 30 days thereafter. The obvious problem is it means that news organizations across the country are receiving funding in their proverbial bank accounts in the middle of election campaign. And this is the most important part. Bill C-18, the Online News Act, is effectively on the ballot. That's because, while it is legislation of the previous Trudeau government and continues to be supported by the Liberal Party, it's opposed by the Conservatives. So depending on the outcome of this election, this legislation may or may not survive, and in turn, the funding that's resulted may or may not survive. You put all of that together, Rudyard, and it seems self-evident that the news outlets reporting on the campaign and receiving funding from the Journalism Collective have a journalistic responsibility to disclose that they're receiving funding because they're reporting on an election in which the funding hangs. And yet, up till today, April 1st, to my knowledge, the only outlet that's received funding that has disclosed it is us, the Hub. And so we call on other outlets that have received funding or are set to receive funding over this course election campaign to disclose it to their audiences. That's all we're asking. Whether they donate it to a charity like we've done or keep it for the purposes of subsidizing their operations, that's almost another debate. In the current moment, the most crucial thing is that they are transparent about the conflict of interest they find themselves in.
Yeah, well said. And look, these are significant sums of money. Under this Online News Act, the Journalism Collective that Sean mentioned, that's responsible for dispersing the funds on behalf of Google, is indicating that it's up to $13,000 per full-time employed journalist. So to give you an idea, back of the envelope calculation, you take an entity like Postmedia. If you look at news reports, they probably have somewhere in the order of, 600 odd full-time journalists across the National Post, the Sun chain, all their various regional papers. That could work out to as much as $8 million annually. And this legislation currently is set up to run for 5 years. So you're talking almost $50 million in subsidies granted through the Online News Act. That's material. That matters. And again, we don't have a beef with these other news outlets as to what they do with this money. They can go hire more journalists, like the legislation would I guess was designed to try to encourage them to do, or they can give it back to their investors. We really don't care. At the Hub, we decided to donate an equivalent amount to charity because we wanted to get this money out of our operation, in a sense, not influence us and not create a perception problem with our audience, which is how can you take money from an incumbent party, have it arrive in your bank account? Okay, we saw it show up in our bank account during the first week of the election campaign. How can you, as a legitimate press organization, see money coming in from the government, from a policy enacted by the incumbent party, opposed by the other party that's vying in this election to replace the incumbent party as a new government, the Conservative Party? How can you report on that election with credibility and authority on behalf of your audience and say, yes, we are objective, we are not influenced? And I think the only way you can do that is you have to disclose it. And unfortunately, you, the viewer, you can't find out who's received this money until it's disclosed by the online news collectives. And Sean said that's going to be well after this election is over. So the only way that you can find out as a Canadian voter going into this campaign is to write and connect with your local paper. And there are hundreds of media outlets receiving this subsidy, basically everyone in Canadian journalism, and ask them, are they receiving the subsidy and how much? We'd be really interested in the answers you get. And if you get any answers, we're not getting any answers, send us an email to editorial@thehub.ca and let's crowdsource this thing, Sean, and find out who's getting the money, how much, and hats off, kudos. We'll say it. Congratulations to any news group that discloses this before Canadians vote so their readers, their listeners, their viewers can have some sense that they are objective, that they have removed their conflict of interest to the extent that they've declared it.
Yeah, well, to that point, what we're really calling for here, it must be understood, is a basic journalistic creed. And this is not a theoretical point. I was thinking about it last night, Rudyard. In the early days of the campaign, what was the principal issue that we were talking about? We were talking about leading Canadian journalists asserting that Mark Carney was in a conflict of interest because of his financial interests.
Good point.
As Prime Minister, and there was an onus on him to come clean, to be transparent about his financial assets and financial interests so Canadians could understand if there were any conflicts that he would have to recuse himself from as Prime Minister. I think the journalists that were carrying out that work were doing precisely what journalists ought to do, and they should be credited. And Mark Carney should rightly be criticized for his defensiveness. But then, if we're going to be consistent, we have to look in the mirror, right, Rudyard? It's one thing for journalists to accuse politicians and others of being in a conflict of interest. It's another thing to ask themselves, are they in a conflict of interest? Are there news organizations in a conflict of interest? And if so, aren't they obliged to do precisely the same thing they were asking Mark Carney to do, which is to be transparent about their interests, so that everyone knows, everyone can make informed decisions about them and their work. The dissonance between what we saw in the early days of the campaign and the silence that we're seeing from news organizations receiving C-18 is something that should make every journalist uncomfortable.
Yeah, and that'll be my final contribution to this. There's a lot of journalists who listen to and watch The Hub. Thank you. You have your own private social media feeds. You have your own voice and your own ethics and your own sense of responsibility to your profession. So I appeal to you, fellow journalists, to go out there and ask on social media or through whatever corporate channels you have access to as an employee, what are your owners' policy with regards to the funds coming from the Online News Act into their businesses, because this isn't the CBC, this is every single major newspaper chain and digital news outlet in Canada. What is your employers, your owners' policy with regards to this money? And indicate to them what Sean just said. The most simple and basic journalistic tenet is not to report out the news when you have a conflict of interest unless you declare it. Your owners are shaming you. They are devaluing your credo, your commitment to the truth by choosing conveniently, I guess because, I don't know, because they're embarrassed to receive this money, because they feel, they know that it affects their credibility with you, the listener, the viewer. There's a reason why they're not disclosing this, because it's not in their business interest to do so. They would prefer for you, the reader, the viewer, to think that everything's okay and that their organization reflects the combined interests of you, all your readers and viewers, when in fact, it represents a significant subsidy that's been bestowed upon it by an incumbent government, with those checks arriving during an election without these groups disclosing these funds. So, Sean, let's wrap it up there. We'll see where this goes. We're going to try to keep the pressure on over the course of the election on our fellow brethren in the media, solely for our own self-interest. You know, this reflects badly on all of us. It creates distrust on the part of Canadians regarding the media, and trust is already pretty low in the press. So we have a vested interest here in seeing everybody come clean and act and behave in the best traditions of Canadian journalism. I'll give the last word to you.
No, that's the final point. At the risk of sounding a bit wonky, this represents a negative externality, which is to say the choices that they're making and the harm that they're doing to their own credibility and trust isn't internalized solely by them. It spills over into other parts of the industry, including us, who've made the decision both not to accept subsidies, and in this particular case, to donate an equivalent amount that we receive from the Canadian Journalism Collective to a charity. And so that's why we're speaking out. We're trying to protect ourselves in a way from the contamination of these subsidies to organizations like ours, who, through no fault of our own, risk facing harm.
Yeah. Well said, Sean. The whole thing is just a giant mess. God, please, let's clean it up. Sunlight, the ultimate disinfectant. Let's do it. Thanks for listening, everybody. You can catch Sean and my op-ed in the Hub today, April 1st, on this topic. Simply go to www.thehub.ca. Get the comments going in this video. We'd love your feedback on what you've just heard. And again, check out the essay and give us your view. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks for your support of the Hub. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.